On the cold, biting morning of the 27th of February 1968, the golden era of rock and roll did not conclude with a final bow under the glittering lights of the Apollo Theater. Instead, it ended in a devastating silence on the cracked linoleum floor of a cramped bathroom at 370 West 126th Street in Harlem. When the police arrived at the home of Frankie Lymon's grandmother, they did not find a cultural icon or the golden throat of a generation. They found a 25-year-old man slumped against the porcelain, his eyes fixed in a sightless stare. Beside his cooling body lay a syringe, the jagged needle that had become his only consistent companion in a world that had long since stopped screaming his name. To the local coroner, it was a routine overdose, another statistic in a neighborhood being hollowed out by the heroin epidemic. But through the lens of history, this was a crime scene where the primary weapon was not a needle, but a record contract. Frankie Lymon was not merely a victim of his own choices. He was the primary casualty of a predatory industry. He was the first sacrificial lamb of the modern celebrity era. A boy handed the keys to the kingdom at 13 and stripped of his humanity by 18. To understand the broken body on that floor, we must look at the vibrant and volatile Harlem that birthed him. Harlem in 1942 was defined by radical duality. It was the Black Mecca, a sovereign territory of jazz and intellectual fire. Yet, beneath the neon marquees, it was also a place governed by crushing economic gravity. This was the world into which Frankie Lymon was born, a city where the church and the street were locked in a constant struggle for the soul of every child. His father, Howard Lymon, was the embodiment of this struggle. By day, Howard drove a truck through the potholed streets of Manhattan, his muscles aching under the labor of a Jim Crow economy. By night, those same calloused hands were raised toward the heavens as he led the Harlemaires, a gospel group that brought the sound of salvation to storefront churches and tenement hallways. Music in the Lymon household was never a luxury. It was a survival strategy. It was the only force loud enough to drown out the winter wind whistling through apartment walls as thin as paper. Frankie was the youngest of 4 boys, and from the moment he could walk, he functioned as a vocal sponge. He did not just hear gospel hymns, he dissected their vocal architecture with forensic precision. He would sit on the edge of the choir bench, watching the veins in his father's throat bulge, absorbing the mechanics of 4-part harmony. By age 7, Frankie had mastered a range that was biologically improbable. He possessed the high soprano of an angel, yet delivered notes with the phrasing of a jazz veteran. In the local churches, old women would whisper that the boy has been here before, their shorthand for a voice that carried a weight of experience his young body should not have known. However, the world beyond the church pews was anything but holy. By age 10, Frankie's domestic stability dissolved after his parents split, and he became a child of the hustle. Harlem was a survivalist economy, and Frankie learned early that childhood was a privilege the poor could not afford. He took a job at a grocery store, ringing up milk and bread for customers twice his age. During the day, he was the polite delivery boy, but as the sun dipped, his bags often contained more than just food. He became a go-between for the neighborhood's darker elements, acting as a courier for men in tailored suits and women in expensive furs. He delivered messages he was not meant to understand, witnessing the neon sins of the night gambling, prostitution, and quiet desperation. He smoked his first cigarette at 10 and tasted his first joint before 11. He was a child forced into the shoes of an adult, navigating the shadows of the ghetto before he even grasped the meaning of the word. Yet, every night, he retreated into the sanctuary of melody. On the corner of 164th Street, a group of local teenagers called the Coupe de Villes would gather under the street lamps. They practiced doo-wop, the music of the dispossessed. They utilized the natural echo of alleyways to transform their voices into an orchestra. Frankie followed them like a persistent shadow. He was often dismissed as too young, but he refused to vanish. One night, during a school talent show, the group's lead singer stumbled. Frankie stepped into the light without a microphone and unleashed that voice. He sang with a joyous intensity that shocked the room into silence. The older boys no longer saw him as a nuisance. They saw an exit strategy. They brought him into the fold, changed their name to the teenagers, and the golden throat was poised for the world. But the world had no intention of protecting the boy behind the miracle. By the spring of 1955, the street corners of Harlem had become a proving ground for a sound that would soon dismantle the racial architecture of American radio. The teenagers were a biological anomaly in a segregated country. While the Supreme Court was still debating the logistics of integration, Frankie Lymon, Jimmy Merchant, Sherman Garnes, Joe Negroni, and Herman Santiago were living a practical experiment in harmony. They were a mix of black and Puerto Rican youth, unified by a vocal frequency that seemed to ignore the barbed wire of Jim Crow laws. They weren't trying to be revolutionaries. They were just 5 kids trying to outsing the noise of the city buses. The genesis of their greatest hit was a moment of urban folklore. Herman Santiago had come into possession of a collection of discarded love letters and poems written by a neighbor. One of those poems, a sentimental piece titled, "Why Do Birds Sing So Gay?" became the group's secret weapon. They spent months harmonizing the lyrics in tenement hallways, using the high ceilings to create a natural reverb. However, it wasn't until Frankie Lymon grabbed the lead that the song transformed into a cultural weapon. Frankie instinctively understood that the song needed urgency. He rewrote the lines, shifted the tempo to a frantic pace, and changed the title to "Why Do Fools Fall in Love?" In late 1955, Richard Barrett marched the group into the offices of Gee Records. Behind the desk sat George Goldner, a man whose life was a gamble between the hit parade and mounting debts. Goldner didn't see children. He saw a way to satisfy his creditors. He booked them into a small studio in Manhattan, but the recording session would become a grueling test of Frankie's endurance. Recording in the 1,950 seconds was a high-wire act with no safety net. There were no digital workstations to fix a flat note. Every take had to be a perfect, unified performance from the singers and the band. Goldner pushed the boys through take after take. He wasn't looking for a good performance. He was looking for the precise moment where innocence met professional precision. By take 20, the brass section was exhausted. But Frankie, standing on a wooden crate to reach the microphone, seemed to grow stronger. Finally, on take 26, the miracle happened. The opening ooh-wah hit with a percussive snap. Frankie's lead vocal soared with a bell-like clarity, haunted by an adult melancholy. Goldner knew he had more than a hit. He had a new genre. He signed the boys to a contract that would become a masterclass in legal theft, but at that moment, Frankie only cared about the sound. The release of "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" on the 10th of January 1956 was a global seismic event. Within weeks, the song bypassed the race record charts and exploded into the white suburban consciousness. This was the first true crossover. White teenagers across America and the United Kingdom were hearing a voice that didn't sound like the sterile crooners their parents loved. They were hearing the sound of Harlem raw, rhythmic, and undeniably human. The song hit number 1 on the R&B charts and climbed to number 6 on the Billboard Pop chart. In the UK, it became the first American R&B record to reach the top spot. Frankie Lymon was suddenly the most famous child in the world. He was the blueprint for the teenage superstar, predating the Jackson 5 by over a decade. He was invited into the inner sanctums of American power, performing for white audiences who had never seen a black child with such confidence. But the forensics of fame show that as the spotlight brightens, the shadows grow longer. Even as the record climbed the charts, label executives were already engineering the destruction of the teenagers. They saw that the money wasn't in harmony, but in the golden boy. They began whispering to Frankie that his friends were holding him back, planting seeds of an ego that would isolate him from the only family he had on the streets. The world had fallen in love with the voice, but no one was looking out for the boy who owned it. In the forensic study of the mid-century music industry, few names evoke as much dread as Morris Levy. By 1957, the fragile world George Goldner had built around the teenagers began to collapse under the weight of his own vices. Goldner was a man possessed by a gambling addiction that far outpaced his success as a record man. He owed vast sums to shadowy figures who didn't accept excuses, and he saw a way to settle his debts by liquidating his most valuable human assets. He sold Gee Records, and with it, the contractual soul of Frankie Lymon to Levy. Morris Levy was more than a businessman. He was the godfather of the recording industry. Operating out of the Birdland Jazz Club, Levy was a man with one hand in the Billboard charts and the other in the pockets of the Genovese crime family. He didn't care for the Harlem Miracle or the artistic nuance of a vocal arrangement. To Levy, Frankie Lymon was a depreciating commodity with a limited shelf life. He understood the brutal mathematics of child stardom. A boy's voice is a ticking clock, and his goal was to extract every cent of equity before the golden throat inevitably deepened into manhood. The first move in Levy's architecture of exploitation was the tactical dismantling of the teenagers. A five-piece group was an expensive touring entity, and 4 other members meant 4 other checks to write. Levy's associates began a campaign of psychological isolation, whispering into Frankie's ear that he was the only true genius of the group. They convinced a 14-year-old boy that his childhood friends were mere dead weight, dragging down his solo potential. By late 1957, the label officially changed the billing to Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers. It was a surgical strike. While the vocal harmony on stage remained intact for a few more months, the brotherhood that had protected Frankie on the streets of Harlem was effectively dead. The financial forensics of this era reveal a masterclass in legal theft. Frankie was performing in $500 silk suits, staying in the finest segregated hotels, and appearing on national television as a symbol of black success. However, the ledger told a different story. Under the contracts Levy controlled, every luxury Frankie enjoyed was a debt added to his account. The cost of his suits, his travel, his meals, and even the promotion of his records was deducted from his royalties. He was an employee of his own fame. While millions of records were sold globally, the money never reached the Lymon household. Levy promised that Frankie's earnings were being diverted into a trust fund that would be made available when he turned 21. This was a convenient fiction. In reality, the money was being used to fuel Levy's empire and settle the debts of G Records. When Frankie eventually reached adulthood and sought his fortune, he found a nearly empty account. For a career that generated millions in revenue, he was handed a final payout of roughly $1,700. The oldest story in black music, the theft of genius by paperwork, had found its most tragic protagonist. Yet, the most devastating theft wasn't financial. It was the theft of Frankie's physical and mental safety. As a 15-year-old solo star, Frankie was forced to navigate an adult world of neon sins without a guardian. He was surrounded by older musicians, predatory hangers-on, and label fixers who treated him as an equal in vice but an inferior in power. He was offered champagne before he was old enough to drive, and was pursued by women twice his age who saw him as a trophy of the new rock and roll elite. The investigation into his decline points to a New Year's Eve party in 1958 as the moment of no return. Surrounded by the hollow laughter of the industry's night dwellers, Frankie was introduced to a new kind of escape. An older woman, a veteran of the club circuit, handed him a needle. She told him it would quiet the noise, that it would make the crushing weight of the tours and the loneliness of the road disappear. In that moment, Frankie didn't see a drug. He saw a way to finally feel as powerful as the world told him he was. The forensics of addiction tell us that the adolescent brain, still under construction, is uniquely susceptible to the neural hijacking of opioids. For Frankie, heroin became the silent partner in his solo career. It muffled the pain of his fractured friendships and silenced the mounting fear that his fame was slipping away. As he stood on the stage of the London Palladium, smiling for the cameras, he was already tethered to a chemical master. Morris Levy had his money, the public had their idol, but the boy from Harlem was already being erased, one dose at a time. By 1959, the most dangerous enemy Frankie Lymon faced wasn't a rival singer or a predatory manager. It was his own biology. In the cruel forensics of the music industry, there is a phenomenon known as the puberty curve. For a child star whose entire brand is built on the crystalline purity of a soprano voice, the natural transition into manhood is not a milestone, it is a terminal illness for their career. As Frankie turned 17, the golden throat began to thicken. The effortless, bell-like highs that had captivated the world began to crack, replaced by a deeper, more common tenor. To a normal teenager, the deepening of a voice is a sign of growth. To the executives at the label, it was a product defect. They didn't see a maturing young man, they saw a broken instrument. The industry's appetite for Frankie Lymon was predicated on his otherness, the shock of hearing such a massive, knowing soul coming from such a small, innocent-looking boy. Once his voice aligned with his physical age, the magic trick was over. The public, which had once chased his limousine down the streets of London and New York, began to look past him, searching for the next miracle that hadn't yet been touched by time. The investigation into this period shows a sharp, jagged decline in Frankie's commercial viability. He was no longer being booked for the primetime television specials or the prestige theater runs. Instead, he found himself relegated to the Chitlin circuit, the grueling network of small, often dilapidated clubs in the segregated South and the inner cities of the North. The audiences were smaller, the pay was lower, and the respect was gone. He was a has-been before he was old enough to vote. This professional abandonment accelerated his chemical descent. Frankie was caught in a psychological pincer movement. The world was telling him he was no longer special, while his addiction was telling him he couldn't survive without the high. Heroin became the only thing that made the transition bearable. When he walked onto a stage in a half-empty club in Baltimore or Detroit, the drug provided a buffer against the humiliation of seeing the empty seats. He was trying to act like the sophisticated man about town he thought the industry wanted, wearing tailored suits and carrying cigarettes he didn't truly enjoy. But behind the mask, he was a terrified boy watching his identity evaporate. The financial desperation led to the ultimate act of self-sabotage. In 1960, desperate for cash to fuel his addiction and maintain the illusion of his former lifestyle, Frankie returned to Morris Levy. In a windowless office, the architect of his exploitation presented a final predatory deal. For a mere $1,500 in cash, Frankie Lymon signed away his lifetime publishing rights and any future claims to the royalties of Why Do Fools Fall in Love and his other hits. It was a forensic suicide of his legacy. For the price of a used car or a few months of drugs, he sold his immortality to the very man who had already stolen his childhood. Levy knew exactly what he was buying. He knew that as long as the radio existed, those songs would generate millions. He bought a diamond for the price of a pebble, and Frankie, blinded by the immediate need for a fix and the crushing weight of his fading relevance, handed it over without a fight. By 20, Frankie Lymon had become a ghost haunting the hallways of his own history. He had everything the world had promised, the fame, the money, the women, and yet he owned nothing he could keep. He was singing about love in bars, so small you could hear the bartender counting tips over the music. Those who saw him perform during these years described a voice that occasionally showed flashes of the old brilliance, but it was a voice that now cracked not from age, but from the spiritual exhaustion of a man who had already lived 3 lifetimes before reaching his 21st birthday. The boy who had made the world believe in happiness was now the saddest song in the room. By the mid-1960 seconds, the wreckage of Frankie Lymon's career had reached a state of total saturation. He was no longer the golden throat, he was a cautionary tale, a spent force wandering the streets of New York looking for the next score. However, in 1964, a sudden change in trajectory offered a forensic glimmer of hope. Facing legal pressure and the inevitable collapse of his health, Frankie entered the United States Army. It was a desperate attempt to find the structure that his childhood in Harlem and the music industry had never provided. Stationed at Fort Gordon, Georgia, Frankie was effectively removed from the toxic orbit of the New York record business. The forensics of this period show a dramatic stabilization of his character. In the humid, quiet atmosphere of the South, away from the predatory gaze of Morris Levy and the easy access to the club scene, Frankie Lymon began to find himself. For the first time since he was 12 years old, he wasn't a product, he was a man. He stayed clean for nearly 2 years, the longest stretch of sobriety in his adult life. During this intermission, he met Amira Eagle, a local school teacher. Amira was the antithesis of the industry groupies and the older women who had facilitated his addiction. She saw the broken man behind the myth. To Amira, he wasn't the boy who sang, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? He was a quiet, polite, and deeply wounded individual who was trying to reclaim his soul. They married, and for a brief window, Frankie lived the life he had once only mimicked in song. He sang in church again, his voice echoing with a new, mature purity that lacked the frantic desperation of his solo years. People in the community noted that he smiled differently. It was a smile of relief, not a performance for a camera. However, the psychological data of child stars suggests that the echo of fame is a difficult sound to silence. Despite the peace he found in Georgia, the Golden Throat was still a prisoner of his own legacy. He wrote letters home speaking of second chances, but the contents revealed a man who was still haunted by the applause. The music industry, having discarded him like a used battery, suddenly sensed a final opportunity for profit. In early 1968, the siren call came from the north. An old manager reached out with a tempting proposition, a major comeback recording session in New York City. The promise was seductive. They told him the world was ready for the adult Frankie Lymon. They told him the sound of the 60 seconds needed his soul. To a man who had been told he was a has-been at 19, the chance to prove his worth at 25 was an irresistible bait. Amira, fearing the ghosts of Harlem, begged him to stay. She understood that New York wasn't just a city, it was the scene of the crime. But Frankie, driven by a forensic need to justify his existence and reclaim the crown that had been stolen from him, packed his bags. He kissed his wife goodbye, promising to return a star. He didn't know that he was walking back into the mouth of the machine. The intermission was over, and the final act was about to begin in the city that had both created and destroyed him. He headed toward Harlem, unaware that the comeback he was seeking would eventually lead to the cold floor of his grandmother's bathroom. When Frankie Lymon stepped off the bus in New York City in February 1968, he was entering a landscape that had become a structural mirror of his own internal chaos. The Harlem he returned to was no longer the vibrant, black Mecca of his youth. It was a city on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The hope of the early civil rights era was being replaced by the smoke of urban riots and the cold, systemic grip of a heroin trade that had moved from the shadows to the center of the street. To a man in recovery, New York wasn't a city of opportunity. It was a minefield. The forensics of his final 24 hours reveal a man caught between two versions of himself. On one hand, there was the new Frankie, the man who had found God and a wife in Georgia, the man who sat in a recording studio on February 26th and laid down tracks for a potential comeback. Witnesses at the session noted that he was sharp, professional, and hopeful. He was singing for his life, trying to bridge the gap between the child star he had been and the artist he wanted to become. But as the sun went down over Manhattan, the old Frankie began to emerge from the shadows. The psychological pressure of the comeback is a unique form of trauma. For Frankie, being back in the city where everyone remembered him as a golden boy, while he felt like a broken man, was an unbearable weight. The investigation suggests that after the recording session, Frankie sought out the old haunts, perhaps looking for a sense of belonging in a neighborhood that had moved on without him. In the dark corners of Harlem, the godfather Morris Levy still loomed large, and the ghosts of the industry were everywhere. Somewhere between the studio and his grandmother's apartment on West 126th Street, the barrier of his 2-year sobriety finally fractured. The transition from a clean life in Georgia to the high-purity street drugs of 1968 New York is a lethal biological equation. The forensics of an overdose often point to loss of tolerance. When Frankie reached for a needle that night, his body was no longer the hardened vessel of a long-term addict. It was the vulnerable body of a man who had been clean for years. His heart and lungs, rejuvenated by the quiet life of a soldier, were unprepared for the chemical shock he was about to administer. He went to his grandmother's house, the place where he had once felt the most protected. Perhaps he thought he could handle one final celebration of his new record deal. Perhaps he just wanted the noise of the city to stop for 1 hour. He locked the door of the small bathroom, a space of porcelain and shadow. The investigation into the scene found no signs of a struggle. There was no grand drama, only the silent, clinical efficiency of a drug that had been waiting for him to come home. On the morning of February 27, Frankie Lymon was found. He was 25 years old. The news didn't stop the world this time. There were no riots in the streets of Harlem, no tributes on the nightly news. The industry simply checked a box and moved on. The golden throat had been silenced, not by age or by God, but by a syringe that acted as the final punctuation mark on a sentence written by Morris Levy and the predatory machinery of 1,950 seconds rock and roll. He had come to New York to find his future. Instead, he found the cold floor of his past. The boy who had made the world fall in love with youth had finally, tragically, run out of time. Death did not end the story of Frankie Lymon. It merely changed the key of the narrative from a tragedy into a legal thriller. When Frankie was laid to rest in the Bronx, there was no grand funeral or industry-led tribute. For years, his grave remained unmarked, a nameless plot of dirt that mirrored the way the music business had erased his identity. However, as the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds progressed, the ghost in the groove began to haunt the radio waves once again. Every time a new generation discovered the ooh-wah intro of his greatest hit, the financial stakes of his legacy grew higher. The forensics of his estate became a battlefield in 1981, when Diana Ross covered Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The song became a global smash once more, reopening the vaults of the past. Suddenly, 3 different women, Elizabeth Waters, Zola Taylor, and Amira Eagle each, claimed to be the legal missus. Frankie Lymon. This wasn't just a quest for romantic recognition. It was a war over millions of dollars in back royalties and publishing rights. The investigation into these claims revealed the chaotic, fractured nature of Frankie's personal life, a life lived in a blur of fame and addiction where legal paperwork was often ignored. Behind the scenes, the shadow of Morris Levy still loomed. He fought to maintain his grip on the songs he had bought from a desperate teenager for $1,500. But time has a way of enacting its own form of justice. In the late 1,980 seconds, Levy was finally caught in a massive federal investigation into the mob's influence on the music industry. The man who had built an empire on the exploitation of black talent was convicted of extortion. He died shortly before he was to begin his prison sentence, leaving the industry he had dominated for decades. In 1993, the narrative finally reached a point of redemption. Frankie Lymon and the teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. On that stage, the surviving members of the group the friends Frankie had been forced to abandon stood together to receive the honor. They were followed by Boys to Men, a new generation of harmony, who bowed to the 5 kids from Harlem who had started it all. The world finally recognized that Frankie Lymon wasn't just a tragic statistic. He was the primary architect of the teen idol archetype. Today, the golden throat lives on in the DNA of every young artist who dares to sing with a maturity beyond their years. From Michael Jackson to Bruno Mars, the lineage of the boy wonder is traceable back to Take 26 Inches, that cold Manhattan studio. Frankie Lymon burned too bright to last, but even when a star falls, the sky never forgets where it once stood. He was the first to show that a black child's voice could capture the world's heart, and though he died in the shadows of a Harlem bathroom, his light remains eternal in the music. The boy who sang about fools falling in love eventually became the man who taught the world how to listen.